The military-industrial complex is a real thing. It is the combination of defense contractors, the Pentagon, and Congress. And they all work together to get the country to spend money on building weapons. In World War II, the United States had to go from having basically nothing for a military to having the greatest military the world has ever seen. They built an immense defense infrastructure, churning out tanks and planes and ships, and that really never stopped. Eisenhower was wary of the relationship between industry and the government, and he saw that the military-industrial complex could get carried away. Eisenhower was born poor. As he put it, so poor he didn't know he was poor. It was a hard life, but it was a good life, and he learned good values, and he was good at sports, and he was smart, and had a pretty happy childhood. Like a lot of kids growing up in the early 20th century on the Kansas plains, Eisenhower wanted to join the military and tried to get into the Naval Academy, ended up getting into the Military Academy, and so joined the Army. Ike was a career officer in World War I, and like all career officers, was desperate to get into combat. He didn't. He was such a good leader that they had him at home training troops, so he never actually got to fight the Germans. This was a source of deep regret to him. After World War I, the U.S. Army essentially disappeared. It was tiny and not strong enough to fight anybody. The U.S. wanted to stay out of World War II. They wanted that to be Europe's war. But Hitler was hard to ignore. Even before the Japanese attacked in 1941, our war effort was gearing up. Ike was a superb staff officer. He worked well with senior officers, particularly General Marshall, who was the chief of staff of the Army. And Marshall actually made the ultimate sacrifice by letting Ike lead the invasion of Europe instead of taking the job for himself.
Let's make this particular victory a quick and overwhelming one.
The preparation for D-Day was vast. You were moving a couple of 100,000 men onto those beaches and enormous fleets and armaments and fleets of airplanes, and at the same time trying to keep it all secret. Ike's most important contribution to the planning of the invasion of Europe were two things. One is he got along with the other generals, and that wasn't easy. And also he guessed right on the weather. The weather was bad at the beaches, and Ike saw an opening. He said, "Let's go," and the rest is history.
Surrender has been achieved by teamwork. To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid.
Eisenhower was seen as a great liberator all over the world. He was the guy who had liberated Europe, and as far as most Americans were concerned, had won World War II. Both political parties wanted Eisenhower to run in 1952, but he didn't want to do it. He had served his country, and he thought he was done. And slowly, eventually, they brought him around by basically arguing that his country needed him one more time. It was his duty. When I came to office, the Cold War had already been going on for several years. It was at a funny juncture because Stalin, the fearsome leader of the Soviet Union, died almost as soon as Eisenhower became president. When Stalin died, Eisenhower asked his advisors, "What are we going to do?" And he quickly discovered there was no plan. Russia was a closed country. There was a moment when Eisenhower tried to seize an initiative and gave a famous chance for peace speech. And he asked the Soviet Union if we could step back here and cool things off.
We could proceed concurrently with the next great work, the reduction of the burden of armaments now weighing upon the world.
It didn't really work. The Soviet Union wasn't really listening, and there were just so many forces building up to continue the Cold War. We were building rockets, and the Soviets were building rockets, and it turned out they were building a bigger rocket than our rocket. And in 1957, the Soviets launched a satellite, Sputnik, and it scared the living hell out of us. When Sputnik flew, Americans freaked out because they knew what that meant. If the Soviets could put a satellite across us, they could also put atom bombs into us. It was less frightening, however, to President Eisenhower.
I would say that we must be watchful and alert and pursue our policies as we've been pursuing.
Eisenhower was unusually calm in the Sputnik crisis, but of course he was the only man who could be calm. He had conquered Europe, and the Soviets were rightly afraid of him. He knew that his popularity would suffer, and it did, but Eisenhower played a very long game. And if you spent too much on the military, it would hurt your economy, and you had to have a strong economy in this long race. Eisenhower knew the capacity of the military to take advantage of panic by spending a lot of money, by building new weapons that weren't going to work but might have felt good to politicians. Ike resisted it. He would say to his aides, "I know how these guys work. I was one of them. I was a general. I know how the system works." He would say that privately. He would not say that publicly. Only at the end of his presidency did he say that publicly. Just a few days before JFK was inaugurated, Eisenhower went on national TV to warn very directly against the military-industrial complex. He laid it out, that if we don't watch how much we spend on this, we are going to undermine our own country, our own liberties and our own economy, and that we have a kind of an internal threat from our own perceived need to spend money on weaponry.
What we are trying to do today is to find a program of security that costs the least, and then, through the most earnest kind of care, to abolish duplication and luxury from expenditures to minimize your cost to you.
Some of the greatest strength is restraint. It's by not doing. It's by not showing off. It's by not waving your arms. It's by not blustering. The best thing you can do is to not panic, but be quietly strong.